Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another Quarantine with Brennifry. As always, I'm Tori. Um, Pretty okay week, a little cabin fevery for me, but we're getting things done. One of my schools is on summer. Yay, summer! So that's been nice. It's taken a little bit of my workload off. I'm still at two other campuses though for a few more weeks. Other than that, finished watching She-Ra, which was really fun. I'm now catching up on all the CW superhero shows because they're making their way to Netflix right now. I think Supergirl's in like 2 more days, and that's like my favorite one. So I'm very excited for that. Yeah, I'm basically watching all the CW shows up to like episode 9-ish, where Crisis on Infinite Earth starts, and then once, because they're not all on Netflix yet, and once they're all on there, I'm gonna watch Crisis on Infinite Earths because I have a little bit of FOMO hearing about how great it was because I don't have cable. But yeah, so very excited to finally get to that point eventually soon, hopefully maybe. My share of the week, I have my Trini figure, Yellow Ranger, Saber-Tooth Tiger. I love her very much. I like her daggers very much. She's very cute. I think she's in a cute pose. Again, it's from that same set Jen got me for my birthday a couple years back. What I love about this set too, though, is that they all have their weapons, which I don't feel like were featured very heavily on the show. Like, I felt like they like brought them out every so often, but like not really. And because I remember being a kid and like having the toy weapons and being obsessed with them. But I got in trouble with my Trini daggers because I took one. Like, you know those things that hang and they're like supposed to catch the flies and they're like sticky? I threw the dagger at it and it got stuck to it. And my dad was really, really mad. But I mean, it was a putty and I had to fight it. And I had pretty good aim. So, yeah, that's my share. I'm going to toss it over to Brenda.
Hi everyone. This week has been kind of the same as Tori's, wrapping up a lot of grading this week, submitted grades, and so now I'm technically officially on summer, though I'm teaching over the summer, so I don't really get a summer because I need to start planning that now rather than later because I need to submit my book order. So I'm actually getting stressed out just thinking about it. But
you mo guai guai fai tip sao.
I mean, it's manageable stress. It's totally fine. I like thinking about this stuff, so I'm excited. I did start watching more regularly K-dramas. So Jen and I have this thing where we watch K-dramas. I love them, but it takes a commitment for me to actually watch one. Just because first off, my glasses, I keep losing them. I can't see from far away. So I keep misplacing them and they're not next to my bed. And if they're not next to my bed, then it's just, I get lazy and I don't want to get up to go look for them. And so it becomes a whole thing, right? And I can't see very well in the dark. So I need to make sure that, I have my glasses in order to watch them. So now that we're in quarantine, I obviously don't have an excuse. I have time. I have my glasses next to my bed. And actually, when I started watching Her Private Life, which is the drama I've been watching, I was just squinting because I was too lazy to go get my glasses. But yeah, I've been watching that. And then wrapping up, well, not wrapping up, I'm following Eternal Monarch week to week. That's on Netflix with Lee Min-ho. OMFG, if you haven't watched it, watch it.
Is that the horse one?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. He's gorgeous, but it's the same writer for Goblin. I loved Goblin. And it was just a great, sorry, that was my phone. If you heard that, let me mute it. It's just a great story. If you like fantasy and you like Lee Min-ho holding a sword and kicking some ass, that's great too. And yeah, so I've been watching that. I also watched The Great. Wow, I watched a lot this week for having a lot of grading to do. Now I'm realizing I watched most of The Great. It was funny, really inappropriate humor sometimes. It's satire, so obviously. But there's a lot of scenes in there that you're just like, I really shouldn't be laughing at that, but I'm going to laugh because I need to laugh. And it's just a light, fun show about Catherine the Great and how she came into power. And Nicholas Hoult just does a really good job of playing the asshole idiot, and I really enjoy him in that role. I don't know why, but yeah. My item of the week is actually part of my Lego village. So I build a lot of Legos, and they're all from the kits. They're all fandom, so I have a lot of superhero ones. But what I do is I'll create short narratives where I will mix my characters. So in this case, I have my Captain Steve Rogers plane, right? This is the plane that he rides, that he's in when he crashes into the ice. But inside, I actually have what's his name? What's her name? I have Carol Danvers. You can't quite tell, right? But that's Carol, and then
And
Rocket Raccoon on there,
okay.
right? And so I'll do like short narratives. So I'll have Mulan inside Tony Stark's uh, Iron Man suit. I don't know why. I just thought that was really
Because she
funny.
belongs in it.
Right. I mean, yeah. And then I have
Could you
Coulson.
imagine? Could you imagine that cross? Like, oh, I need this.
Well, that's hence my Lego village, right? So a lot of people write fan fiction. I have my fan fiction in the form of Legos. But yeah, it's one of my things. So this is I build all of them. Obviously, it's a great stress reliever. But I also just really like creating these short narratives, and some of them are funny, some of them are aspirational, and others are just kooky and ridiculous. So
I feel
that's my
like Mulan's Iron Man name would have something to do with like some like weird spelling of like iron and honor like mixed together. And then she'd have like the Emperor's pendant where like Tony Stark's like heart beam thing goes on this suit. Like, oh, I need this so badly.
The Iron Maiden.
Right? Like, oh, that'd be so great.
I'm glad you enjoy that. I'll share more of those in the future. But
That's
yeah,
so lovely.
how about you, Jen? How you been this week?
I've been okay. So I've been, I was finishing up grading like you all, also finishing up a couple like program things as well. Um, but I don't really go into work. This is my pleasure time right now talking to you both. So I like to keep and work and my other life kind of separate. I need those kind of boundaries for my own sense of sanity and health. So in terms of what I've been doing on my daily, I've been watching a lot of TV, just like you all, just a lot of Netflix. So I finished I rewatched and binged and finished Avatar Aang.
Hell yeah.
So I finished that sucker in like a day or two. So it's really nice just being able to rewatch the entire series again. I have all of it on DVD. I watched it like a couple years ago based on like Tori's recommendation. But now it was really nice to just go back to it and just kind of find different moments that I enjoy now more than I enjoyed then. So that was one that I really enjoyed. It's now on Netflix, so if you're interested, go watch that. Like Brenda, I've been watching The Eternal Monarch, and oh my god, so great, just for Lee Min Ho. Oh my god, it's just guys, it's just so great. I know there's a lot of just discussion out there about how like this is one of the writers. So just to give you context, like the writer Kim Un-suk, I think that's her name. She is known to make really big blockbusters in Korea, and so for the last couple of years, she's had like really big blockbusters in terms of ratings. They're like 12 and over, so that's 12% nationwide and over. And so like because of like every drama she keeps getting more and more ratings, like every drama there's this big expectation of what's the next bar she's going to break. And so like The Eternal Monarch came on, and she's reuniting with Lee Min Ho, who starred in a previous drama of hers. And she, people were like, this is a winning match, right? There was just a lot of investment. If you see it's on a Netflix, like the production value is incredible, but it hasn't really been doing really well in the ratings domestically. And a lot of people are just like commenting on like, has she lost her touch? Has she been,
Oh, no.
is this a clunker? This is definitely a clunker, a lemon for her, and there's like the plot isn't great. And you know what? Like, I think that as evident in like her recent dramas, I feel like she's actually writing this not for a Korean audience. She's writing this for an international audience. Like it feels very like the story itself is like Korean King Arthur.
Yeah.
or Korean Sherlock Holmes, like the pacing of it, the story elements, the characters feel very American British. And I think that's part of the reason why it's not landing so well with domestic viewers. Plus you had like a competition of like the World of the Married, which is also an adaptation of a British show. That's like killed it out of the park. It was like a direct competition with
I've actually seen a few videos, like short videos, clips of the World of the Married on Instagram, and that looks like an intense drama.
It is. It's one of those dramas that completely captivated the nation. It went to like 28% nationwide.
Oh,
And
wow.
so it's about cheating, right?
Yeah.
So like there's a lot of just interesting, I feel like with
A lot of violence too. But
yeah,
like domestic violence, that's just like you'll be no, but this is like, I'm sorry, yes, it's awful, but it's the kind of thing where they'll be at a dinner party and they'll be like trying to keep it hush hush, and then someone will like stab someone out of nowhere in the middle of a dinner party, and you're like,
I mean,
what?
that's my kind of crazy, but like,
Well, that's
wow.
what I mean. That the kind of violence that you see is very well, at least in the video clips, because I haven't actually seen the drama. But the clips that I've seen on Instagram, I'm just like, this is a little intense for me.
it's a lot. It's very intense. Like that scene in particular is actually like one of her dreams. It's not like something that actually happened. Something that
I
she
thought so. That didn't look like it. Okay,
yeah.
cool. Good to know.
But you know, there's a lot of interest in Korean dramas and Korean culture, I think, around the idea of cheating, right? And the idea of like violence. And so like this drama just completely it wasn't projected to be a big success like The Eternal Monarch, but this drama just blew everything out of the water and just came out with like 28% ratings. Like people were so in tune with this drama. And you know, this was a great boon for like the actress who's like 40 and over. So you know, in Korean culture, like, you know, American culture, once you hit that like platform of 40, like you're kind of done in a way, right? So like this is a great boon for her to be able to come out with a drama with that much strong ratings. But you know, that said, like I think The Eternal Monarch is not written for a Korean audience. It's like while Korean, it's actually written for an international audience, and that's why like I don't think it's hitting so well with domestic viewers. So that one's great. Hospital Playlist is beautiful. Just go watch it. It's just so great. It's great to see adults just being friends, and just it's a lovely drama. And I think I watched several more things, but I don't remember. But that's enough about Korean dramas. This is my show and tell for the week. This is an Iron Man Q fig figure. So that's part of the same line as the previous Batman and Superman figurine that I showed you. I have quite a number of Q figs in my collection because I like just the detail of the Q fig with the price points. So versus Funkos are a little bit they're about the same price point, but they're a little bit more generalized. Funkos are cute. I have a ton in my collection, but I'm starting to really like more detailed statuettes. I think that's just showing my maturity. But
It's the same maturity as you're holding up a superhero figurine.
Right. But what's really cool about this one too was it also lights up. So
It's so cool.
So it's a really cool thing. I obviously don't keep it lit up because I don't want to waste the battery. But that's my show and tell for the week. So, you know, we're finishing up the month, right? We spent a lot of time talking about Asian stories. We started the month off with Jackie Chan Adventures because that was part of our huge childhoods, right? We moved on to Mulan, another big facet of your childhoods, right? And then we talked about Bend It Like Beckham, and now we're finally to our last installment. So we decided to choose Relic Hunter, and this was my personal choice. We wanted to make sure that we kind of had a lot of diversity in our picks. So Relic Hunter follows Sydney Fox. It's a Canadian production, if I'm correct. I might not be.
You're right. No, you're right.
Thank you. So it follows Sydney Fox, who's a history professor slash archaeologist slash relic hunter, basically a female Indiana Jones out there. And it's 3 seasons long, and every episode essentially is find the relic. So instead of find the monster of the week, it's find the relic of the week. And through the relic, you're getting pieces of revisionist history being told as well through that relic. So we get to find, for example, we go on adventure. The pilot episode is finding Buddha's bowl. And so we get a little bit of who Buddha is, what does that mean, like where did this bowl come from, and the idea is like she's going to recover this bowl and give it back to the people that back to its culture essentially, or get the relic and give it to a museum. So Sydney Fox is also Hawaiian in this iteration, so she is representing Pacific Islanders out there. And her sidekick is British. So there's a lot in this series, and I just kind of want to start off with first impressions. I watched this when I was young, so I know Tori came into it after my recommendation. Brenda,
Like 2 weeks ago.
Yeah. So I kind of want to know what your impressions of it were.
Yeah, I really liked it. I was hooked episode 1. I was a little worried at first that like it might not have aged well, or I like might not like it, or because I was never really like an Indiana Jones fan. But I fell in love with it like right away. Like Sydney is such a great character. She like she's really strong and she's really smart and like she's very charismatic, and like I think what I really liked about her, like, so in the very first pilot episode with the Buddha Bowl, she's in direct competition with another relic hunter who wants to sell the bowl for like a bunch of money to this like guy who's gonna do whatever he's gonna do with it. I think he's trying to like fix his company or something that's bankrupt because the bowl can give you what you need. And like she's like, no, it belongs with the people, not with this guy or in a museum. And I really liked that kind of like statement as she was like kind of going through the jungle, and it's actually quite funny. Another thing I really liked, I'm always looking at the martial arts and things. I really liked that we had an Asian female protagonist who fights really well, but it's not like kung fu or like some traditional Asian martial art. It's like just like let's just bop you and kick you in the like face. Like it's not, it's like brawling. It's like
wrestling.
Yeah, like it wasn't like any type of like, because I feel like that happens a lot, like with Asian stereotype. It's like, oh, this like Asian character can fight, it must be some ancient martial arts. And I like that they didn't do that with her, that she, she's like, just a tough chick. Like she just will kick your butt.
Yeah. On a similar note, I watched it when I was a kid, and I'm such a child of the 90s, I'm not gonna lie. For me, it was very much in line with like Xena and Hercules, right? Obviously very different writers, very different production companies, right? Hercules and Xena were actually produced and shot in New Zealand, or was it Australia? I don't know. It was done under. Whereas Relic Hunter is a Canadian production, right? But in tone, I think they both strike very similar tones, right? Strong women. The fight styles are very similar, right? They because the 90s, it was such a huge, and the early 2000s are huge in terms of wrestling, right?
Yeah.
And using wrestling as a way to convey a story. They tried to do the opposite and incorporate more wrestling into narratives like this. So I think that's one of the things that is just enjoyable. I'm not a huge wrestling fan. I'll watch I'm a casual watcher at best. It's not my favorite way to tell a story. I just think it's a fascinating way to tell a story. So I do enjoy those elements. In terms of Sydney, I love her. She's
great.
She's gold. I mean, honestly, I really enjoy just the badassery aspect, but also the fact that she's smart, she's quick as a whip, and is really just there to be her, right? There's no social norms that she's trying to adhere to, right? She's an expert in archaeology, and the funny thing to me is it doesn't seem like she has necessarily a specialty, which, as a scholar, we all have our niche, right? We all have, like, we all like literature, right? But we're not experts in all of literature because that's insane and impossible, right? So it doesn't necessarily seem like she has a specialty, which is interesting. I like Nigel, and he's just like he's a straight man in in the series, right? He's very serious, doesn't know how to fight. He kind of has to rely on, he's the damsel in distress
He's
in the
totally the damsel in distress.
and I like that switch, right? I really do enjoy that. But I also just enjoy his accent because he plays the being lost and utterly kind of incapable of defending himself really well. And then there are moments where like he actually gets in her way, right? I was just watching an episode where there was a someone was on it was a Scotland episode, and they're on the plane, and there's someone, he was asleep while someone's trying to rob them in the train compartment, and he wakes up and he has a book, and so he hits the guy with the book, and just then Sydney comes in and he's like laying down trying to help with the book, and he ends up hitting Sydney instead of the thief. And it's just I mean, the physical humor is really well done in the series, so I do enjoy it. There's some issues that I have with it, and I think we'll talk about them later. But I also like Claudia. The Claudia character actually gets replaced later in the series.
Is
She's
she
very
the secretary person?
Yeah.
secretary.
Okay, yeah, she's funny.
She's like the quintessential Clueless character, right? Literally, she's like Cher from Clueless, right? Where she's just kind of all over the place. She's really smart in very weird moments where you don't actually expect her to be smart. She's really quick. And then she's kind of ditzy in other moments, right? So I like the breath that she kind of brings into the role. And I was really sad when they replaced her because the replacement was whatever, but I really like Claudia.
Yeah. So I grew up with this Relic Hunter when I was young, right? Like it was on Channel 13, UPN. And I just remember being fascinated and just being enthralled. Here was this like strong, smart Asian woman on television, kicking butt and like doing history stuff. So I was just like, as a child, that was just completely and utterly just fascinated by her. And I love that she kicked butt and everything. I like, I guess I was was a nerd or academic as a child because I really enjoyed the retelling of history via this this whole relic kind of, trope. And I love the humor in it as well. Like it was really funny, like Nigel not knowing how to fight and like Sydney having to bail him out, right? And just I also think that it had like one of the coolest theme songs ever.
Yes, absolutely.
And so like that's one of the things that I can't forget is that like it just has like one of the coolest theme songs ever. And Claudia is actually, the actors that plays Claudia actually ended up on a show that's very similar, like called The Librarians, which is really funny to me, where she plays like this math genius in that one instead. But the 90s were kind of full of these kind of shows where you have like history kind of infusing the episodes. I remember Wishbone kind of has
I loved
Wishbone. I love Wishbone too.
I loved that show so much in third grade.
Great.
I think that's such a telling thing, right? Because it's the 90s, right? We're approaching the millennium. And you guys remember the millennium. We were all ready for Y2K.
The end of the world.
Right? There was a lot in our shows, particularly in our fiction, a lot of looking back to try to understand our present. So I think that's what we see a lot of in our fiction.
Definitely. And so I really just didn't, like you said, Brenda, like I was into Xena too. So like Sydney was just an extension of like these like badass women characters, right? That I got to grow up with. I didn't get to grow up with Mulan, but I grew up with Sydney Fox, right? And I definitely loved her like mini crossbow. So
yes,
like she just got to pull it out and it's like a little mini crossbow. I'm like, I want that when I grow up.
Okay, that's actually another conversation. What's with the crossbow in the 90s? Because Buffy also had one.
That is true. That is true.
It's not quite a gun, but it will still mess you up.
Right.
Yeah.
Because guns are bad for kids. But crossbows, you'll be fine.
It's very true. It's very handy as well. Like you can just pierce someone in the heart with the arrow. Yeah. So, for me, like Sydney just was such a great role model, right? Because she wasn't just a like badass, but she was like really smart. Like she's, I think, one of the reasons why I like academia, right? And like I liked history, why I like English, why I like fiction, right? Because like she was that person. Like every episode, you learn a little bit more about culture, right? You learned a little bit more about history, and so for me, like she was a great role model for that. Was that I can be strong and smart, and
Yeah.
that was important. And I don't know like how much of that exists now. Like maybe it's just like us being older, but I don't feel like there's a lot of positive role models like that.
I totally agree. I have a sibling that's much, much younger than I am. We're about 18 and a half, 19 years apart. And the shows they're watching on television are so night and day, in my opinion, on just like in terms of role model. Like, I feel like everything's about getting that like pun joke in, or it's all about that joke. And I don't, like, so I'll watch things with her and I'm just like, I'm sitting there and I'm like, but what's the lesson? Like, because I felt like a lot of my childhood shows had a lesson somewhere in there. Like, don't steal, help your friends, be a good person, or whatever that lesson might have been. And I didn't ever really see it like in the stuff
I
that she
do.
watches.
I do think a lot of our media when we were growing up had social justice elements woven in.
Yeah.
The funny thing to me, as you guys are talking, is I'm not actually watching a lot of the shows that kids are watching, right?
Mhm.
But I am consuming a lot of TV, and I think what has changed now is TV is a lot more explicit in its social justice
Mhm.
pursuit, right? I'm thinking about Supergirl and the last few seasons that we've had of Supergirl,
Yeah.
where it's not just that the social justice element is there, it is actually the main story.
Mhm.
And sometimes the metaphors are done really well and subtle, like they were in Buffy. Sometimes they're really over the very explicit and trying to beat the viewer over the head with it. And sometimes it's well done, sometimes it's not.
Yeah.
I think some Supergirl episodes are done really well, where others it's just like, okay, they're weird, right? They're not great. But it's a hit and miss. So I don't necessarily know that there's. I think what has changed is whereas with our media, the lesson was, oh, at the end there was literally someone telling us don't steal, right?
Yeah.
I
Sailor
think
Moon
that,
says, Sonic says, like there was all these like, turn off the water when you're done brushing your teeth. Like,
right. I think what our media is doing now is it's trusting its viewer a little bit more to make those connections themselves, right? And so I don't know that that's necessarily the kind of
yeah.
media that we need, because in some cases I do think the explicit lesson is necessary. But I do think that writers are trusting their viewers a little bit more in terms of the lessons, right? They expect their viewers to be intelligent enough to see it in the story, at least hope for it. I don't know, maybe that's me being naive, but I think that that's definitely happening in a lot of stories, at least.
I can see that, right? I can see that TV has become a little bit more nuanced in its way of telling serialized television and stories, right? Um, Relic Hunter, Wishbone, like the ones Power Rangers, that was an era where like it was episodic by nature. There was no sense of like a season long arc. There was no sense of like multiple arcs in a season, right? Like what you see like in something like Supergirl nowadays, right? Like you have many arcs building up to like our larger season arc with like a big bad or just a big like story to tell, right? Like back when we were watching Xena and Buffy, and not Buffy per se, Buffy came later, but Relic Hunter, Power Rangers, all those shows were just episode by episode. So there is no concept of season, right? Except like maybe you got a tall order, but there's no sense of like
Right.
overarching just story there. And
Right.
that's
I think
why
the most you get in Power Rangers is like a 3 episode spread for Tommy's Green Ranger arc, and it's like 3 episodes, maybe two. Like,
And they were all aired together, right? And to
yeah,
be fair, I'm comparing adult TV shows to
right.
children's programming, right? So like I said, I'm not as versed with
Yeah.
um children's storytelling, one of the things that you need to be with children is explicit, right? So a lot of our lessons were explicit. The thing is, we were watching things like Xena, and which is probably not appropriate for children, especially Hercules. There's just a lot. Actually, Xena might be less appropriate just because there was a lot of
Xena's darker.
it is darker. That's what I'm getting at. Is some of the themes are really intense. I'm a little surprised that I watched them not surprised, but yeah. I probably shouldn't have. But
What else is there to watch? What else is there to watch on a Saturday in the afternoon?
Especially when you don't have cable, right? And when your English teacher tells you, you know what, you really need to learn how to speak English. So I'm like, all right, fine, then I will watch TV and absorb the English. Sorry.
That's a terrible thing, and like terrible teacher.
Yeah, right? Seriously.
Yeah, well, she was my second grade teacher. Very nice woman beyond that aside, but it was, I really learned how to speak English as a result of TV. So thank you, Xena and Hercules. But that's aside, sorry.
I think going back to like that, these episodes were episodic by nature, right? Like that's why the moral was so explicit. Like it was at the end of every episode, right? Versus like nowadays with television, it's at the end of the season, or it's at the end of like 5 or 7 episodes that are like, those are the mini arcs within the season, like leading up to the mid-season finale, right? So like Crisis on Earth, like that's something that Tori was talking about earlier, was like you had everything in those shows coordinating like storylines to lead up to Crisis, which was the mid-season finale, right? And then after that is the fallout of that Crisis on Infinite Earths, and then the season finale, right? Like that's how storytelling nowadays on television has become more intricate and more complicated and more complex, right? Versus like what we used to watch when we were growing up, where it was like every episode was a one-off, right? You can come in at any point and, not be lost. And I think that builds a sense of familiarity as well, right? And why like we felt, there was maybe more hard lessons to be learned from those types of television viewings. But I think it also kind of, for me, it's, rewatching Relic Hunter, it's almost a comfort zone. Like it's kind of nice just being able to have it in the background and just kind of decompress after a day and not have to be really intensely following a storyline. Right. And it's nice that I'm still kind of getting something out of it, where like I'm still learning about a culture, even if it's completely wrong, or it might not be 100% right? But I'm still kind of engaging in history, and I'm engaging in fiction in a very robust kind of way. Is there something you wanted to say, Brenda?
Well, no, it was an issue of word choice. I don't know that robust is necessarily accurate. But only because, I don't know, there's some episodes, and I think you're right, actually. You know what? It definitely hits better in some episodes than others. A lot of the history that we're seeing is very much through a white lens, right? Through the colonialist lens, right? And so that's problematic. But on the other hand, you're also like, I think the Buddha episode, for example, was done, I think it was done with respect to the culture. But I'm not of the culture, so I don't know. And yet that's the same episode where we have a mud wrestling scene between 2 women, right? So in that sense, it's very also male gazy. And so, I mean, those are some of the issues that, like, so yes, on one hand, it feels very comfortable because I felt the same way that you did, right? And I feel that same way when I watch Hercules and Xena. And I'm just going to keep lumping them together because I remember watching them on the same days, right? Saturday afternoons. Different channels, I think it was, but
5 and 13.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so different channels. But on the other hand, watching it now as an adult with all the criticism that I've been reading and stuff, I don't know. I can't watch it too intently because then I get mad, if that makes sense.
And it's not meant to. I don't feel like it was meant to be taken seriously.
Absolutely not. It can't be. All 3 series are very campy for that reason, right? Because it doesn't take itself too seriously, and that's one of the things I really, really enjoy.
Right, and I think when I say robust, they're robust to the extent that this isn't a documentary. Like
Mm.
robust, right? Like that's robust. Like that's not like we're not watching Ken Burns reciting Civil War, right? Like it's robust for the episode we're focusing on, in the same way like Supernatural is robust for the monster of the week that it's demonstrating, right? Like that's what I meant by robust. But you bring up really interesting points that we want to talk about, like the colonialism aspect, the exotic woman aspect. Like these are things that you guys brought up as you were watching. Like obviously I'm not blind to it either, but let's kind of take a moment to talk about the gaps and the things that we saw when we were reading. So what were the issues that you guys had?
Yeah, so I guess so this is my first exposure to it, and coming in kind of adult brain, I immediately was like, yeah, no, I would not have been allowed to watch this as a child. There were too many bra scenes and too many like in your underwear scenes that my parents would have had a fit. Specifically my mom would have been like, absolutely not, like go watch Gullah Gullah Island or something like instead, right? Like but as an adult, I I could kind of see like what they were doing, why they were doing it. I did like, however, that they were like very much equal opportunists for like underwear scenes. Like we got Sydney in her underwear as much as we had Nigel in his underwear. So I felt like at least they were like being equal. So, right? I'm like, I guess equality is equality. Um, and so like there's a lot of that. But then part of me was also like, if I had Sydney's body, I'd show it off too. But like, right, I was like, she looked great. But like there was a lot of that, like kind of back and forth for me. I did feel like it fell into like exoticism, right? Where you take like minority women and you like heavily exotify them, especially in that opening scene in the pilot where she's doing that tribal dance in like very revealing clothing and she's like moving her hips. And I mean, it was well choreographed and it worked with what she was doing in the show, but that was like a big red flag for me. I was like, oh, yep, here we go, exotic minority, got it.
Well, and I mean, so that scene for me as a teacher is really fascinating because we all know that first day, right? First day is syllabus, right? First day of class is syllabus. That's probably the most boring day that is.
Yep.
But we also know the problem of enrollment, right? If your class doesn't hit a certain level of enrollment, it gets canceled. So on one hand, when I first watched it, I felt the same way you did, Tori. This time that I watched, I'm like, but she's trying to get students not to drop. I get that.
Yep.
Right. And so
I'm humanities, man, if you're not required.
Right. And I was so frustrated because it's not an easy answer, right? It's not, she's not wrong. She's not right. Right. It's like, oh, this is so frustrating. But I love that I felt that way, right? I absolutely love that. It was not a comfortable place. And that said, I'm pretty sure Sydney is a tenure track professor. So she probably has job security in a way that we wouldn't, right? And so that's a different issue.
You know what really resonated with me though was that scene where she has that student, he's being a know-it-all, and she's like, do you want to teach my class for me? And I was like, yes. Because I've had that same student who's like, well, actually, this is what MLA format looks like. I'm like, no, it doesn't. Like, I know you were in AP English, but that's not how this works in college.
We have all had that student. Oh my goodness.
Right, like he's just going and you can see her getting more and more annoyed, but trying to foster his creativity and his intellect and not shut him down. But she's like, can you just shut up and let me do my freaking job?
I actually know what I'm doing. So actually talking about that scene that you were just mentioning, so that was my second reaction to it. But at the same time, that same scene, that one and another bra scene for Sydney actually become part of the opening sequence, right? So you see it every single time you're gonna watch, because this is back when we had opening sequences. Man, I miss those, you guys. I really do miss those. They get you hyped up.
Openings too.
So it actually becomes part of the opening sequence, which means every time you're watching this episode, you actually see Sydney in her underwear, whether it's her bra or just the dance outfit that she was wearing, right? And so it becomes part of the hook, using Sydney's sexuality, and it's part of the joke, at least in the series, right? To use her sexuality as part of like the appeal of the show, which I don't feel like it's necessary. Right? I think Sydney is smart, funny, and interesting enough that you don't need to resort to that tactic. But
Right,
like you,
right.
Tori, I also have the other issues. Like, well, yeah, if she's okay with it, and I think the show does a really explicit job of showing us that she's okay with her sexuality, and this is actually part of her, then I'm okay with it, right? But it's this this is what's so complicated about feminism, right? My version of what I'm happy with my body is not necessarily somebody else's definition, and it is wrong for me to impose my ideology on somebody else, right? And one of the things that the show sets up really quickly is that Sydney, the character, is very much okay with showing as much skin as necessary, or not even necessary. She doesn't really care. Nudity is just a
Yeah,
thing.
she's kind of like, yeah, because there's that whole scene where she like just like almost gets in the shower with Nigel. She's like, it's my turn, get out, bye. And then
Well,
like,
she does actually. She does jump in the shower, and he gets out, and he's all soaped up, and he's like, "What are you doing?" Right? But again, it goes back
yeah,
to those like very Western ideals about nudity
yeah.
and the
Well,
And
prudent
when
and
they
that
get the,
scene,
they share the
covering
bed
up,
because it's
right?
like more economical. She's like,
right.
yeah, there's only one bedroom available, so deal with it.
And that scene kind of sets up that conflict between
Yeah,
like what, perceived sexuality and how women should act versus like how like a woman is comfortable acting, right? Like Nigel's own British conservative
yeah.
sensibility always
He
pushed up
was
against,
so uncomfortable.
right? It's always pushed up against Sydney's like more just flippant attitude, right?
Yeah,
Well, and it sets her up as this woman of the world, right? She's much more versed in terms of like what's acceptable in different cultures, and she drops that just casually into conversation quite a few times.
And for me, like, the idea of sexuality here, like, it doesn't really bother me, um, in a sense that, like what you, like Tori said, like, it's always like, oh, I have to just do it, right? Like, it's more
hmm,
economic. It's not like she's a pinup doll, right? It's like she's
No,
doing it
no.
because the job, like it's the job, and she's always
right.
prioritizing the job ahead of it. So like if that means changing clothes, she's gonna do that, right? That
Hmm.
means like getting ready really quickly in her office because a relic is coming in and she has to go on that. She's gonna do that, right? It's always
Well,
about the work
and
for
that
her.
scene in particular is very teacher too,
Mhm.
right? Particularly when you're a part-timer, right?
Hmm.
Sometimes you actually do have to get changed in your office because you're running from one place to the other, or in the adjunct bathroom, right?
Hmm.
Because that's the only place you're going to have a moment of privacy. So I really do like how they dealt with that. The thing that bothered me was the mud scene, and actually subsequent fight scenes between Sydney and particularly female villains. That's more where I had an issue with. But sorry, Jen. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think you were gonna go on there, but for me, like it didn't bother. Like I want to say, like it didn't bother me just because it was never about sexualizing her. Like for
Hmm.
her, she was okay with her body and her sexuality, and she was confident. For me, that was important to see someone who was confident in her body, because I think there's a lot of body shaming that goes on in media,
Yeah.
right? And for her, it's, she's like, yeah, I look great, I'm going to show it off, or like I'm going to prioritize the work, it's not a big deal for me, right? Like I'm okay with who I am as a person. I think that level of self-confidence and just body positivity from Sydney was important to see as a child for me, because now, like, you know I feel like that had a positive impact for me as a child. But that said, like there are issues like that mud scene. Like I'm sure this also was a product of the 90s, and like Baywatch was like a big
Oh
thing
yeah.
growing up, right? And like, so I'm not surprised that they capitalized on like mud scenes where like, or female fight scenes, right, where like it could be more sexual and more savage in nature.
Right. And this was very much a product of the 90s, that mud wrestling scene. And happens in the first episode toward the end, where Sydney and the female villain end up fighting, physically wrestling, and they actually end up in this massive mud puddle thingy, right? And so while the men are also fighting each other, they make a joke out of it, and they actually stop to watch the two women wrestling in the mud, right? And it's a shameless thing, and it's very much the writers were in on the joke, right? And that's what it appeared on screen as. And so that becomes a running joke, or not running joke, but a running theme throughout the series, where Sydney's fighting particularly busty women, right? There's this one episode where it's a white woman who is like the priestess to Osiris or something, right? And her hair is really big. She has a bustier, and there's actually a joke about the bustier that Sydney says. And a lot of the shots are actually focused on her breast when they're fighting, right? And so those are the kinds of scenes that really bothered me. But that's actually what caught my attention with the fighting, right? It wasn't martial arts. It was very much wrestling, right? WWE style wrestling. That showed up consistently. And that's one of the reasons why I say this is such a product of the 90s, because you see it consistently throughout the series, right? And it's very in line with things like not Superman, Hercules and Xena, and I would say Baywatch, but I don't actually remember watching Baywatch. I just remember the scene, like the opening scene, and I just turn off the TV. But,
right. And I think, I think thinking about like the women characters and the women villain characters, they're always like big, blonde, busty women, white women. So that's a really interesting conversation point for me.
It is, and that's actually what I wanted to bring up. It's that, for one, they're definitely overly, like, whereas Sydney's sexuality is not a huge selling, like, it's not, I'm not saying that's not a selling point, it is, totally is, but it's not a huge focus of the show. The sexuality of the white women who are often the villains definitely is, and that's an odd thing for me. I haven't really wrapped my head around it.
Well, and that the fact that it's like, a woman of color going up against a white woman, right? And just like, what are the layers of just like racial tension there?
Right. And so this opens up, then that's why I said it's very white male gazy, right? And it's a very white male perspective and colonialist perspective, right? Because this is what men think women of color and white women have, that this is how we would fight, right? And I just think that's fascinating to me. I don't even know, like, every conversation I've had about race with a white woman has gone nothing like what you see on TV, right? And even any argument that I've ever had. No, actually, I prefer to
better. Like, wouldn't you feel better just like being in a mud fight though, Brenda?
And throwing a punch or two, maybe the punch or two would help.
The punch or two might actually sell it.
Right?
Right.
I feel like that would help you. Like, you would enjoy that. Like,
see, it also sets up this really weird female competition thing, right? That you see consistently replicated in media, and so that is troubling on one hand. But I also think it's accurate, not physically accurate, right? But in showing the struggles that women of color often face in terms of ensuring their own equity, like in self-advocating, right? Oftentimes it actually does become the white woman who becomes a roadblock to that, right? And so I think in that you see a lot of, and I'm not saying this is the case for and a lot of cases white women become very strong allies, right? But sometimes they don't. They become the villain in Sydney's case, right? Where it becomes difficult to overcome that, and the show's answer for it is a punch or two, or a mud wrestling scene,
as one does.
Well, and
right.
To kind of add to the conversation about like white women allies, like you do have that eventually in a later like season with Kate, I think that's her name, who is this, she works for the government. She's basically like a spy, or she's an FBI agent of some sort. But she's like that kind of alias type. She's very strong, and she's smart, and she and Sydney actually have a really great working relationship together. So, again, like, I think they're kind of,
Claudia,
right. So I think that, yeah, while the show does have a tendency to kind of portray a certain type of villainous character, they also kind of have other women characters to help kind of balance that out. Not to say that it's a perfect show, it's not, but I do think that they do offer different types
Mhm.
of women characters. What I also find interesting is how Nigel kind of is a bit of a different type of sidekick, right? Like nowadays, he's the equivalent of the girl tech in any superhero show, where like he's super smart and like dorky and kind of clunky and just clumsy, and then maybe love interest, maybe not. But it's interesting for him to play that role of like a damsel in distress, right?
Right, that
And
Felicity Smoke character, if you will. There's air quotes there.
yeah,
Like that's totally who he's playing. Like it's
right. And I think it was so interesting to kind of have that be a male character pedal back in the 90s, right? Because you would have expected him to play the Indiana Jones part, right? And
right. With
instead,
Sydney playing his role.
right. Instead, like he is the smarty, he's the nerd.
Yeah.
He's actually the one that's like the act, like he's the one like telling her all the historical things about the item.
Yeah.
Right, and looking up the language. So like I enjoyed that kind of flip of character of trope for him.
There's a scene that I really, really enjoyed actually, where they're it's the California flag episode, and they're in this like really rough bar, and Nigel bumps into somebody and he goes, "Oh, pardon me," and he, you know, his English accent, and keeps walking on, and then these group of guys start making fun of him, and Sydney, and like you can tell like Nigel's feeling really bad, like because, you know, he's being made fun of like very openly, and Sydney goes and like totally kicks all of their butts, like she like kicks the like chair and like knocks the guy down, and then like things like that, right? Because she's like, don't make fun of my friends, like, and I liked that moment because that is so much what we would see reversed gender role wise, is the guy, you know, running to this poor bullied girl's defense, and then now they're in love, and like, and
Right.
yeah, and she becomes that hero. And then there's that scene like shortly after they get jumped by the same people, and Nigel's like, "I got the shovels that we need to dig," and she's like, "I need it now." And she sort of hits this guy in the head with the shovel, like, which again you would expect him to do, and he like doesn't even know how to use the shovel to like attack with. He's like, "Ah."
Well, I mean, and this is a guy who uses books for defense, right? And quite literally in some cases when he uses them as weapons, which I think that's a really funny visual gag. But yeah, there's with Nigel you get the damsel in distress, right? But he's also the heart a lot of the times, right? Especially if there's like a female client, I guess. Well, not, are they clients, the people who come to her looking for help with relics? What do you call them?
I guess you could call them clients. Yeah.
Okay. So whenever there's a woman who needs help, it's usually Nigel who like forms that emotional connection, right? So he'll be the one who will talk to the client, and then we get the narrative, right, and what's happening there. Unless they come straight to Sydney, then it's a really short, quick in there. But with Nigel, a lot of it, like he'll fall for the girl, and that, but it's always kind of like that hopeless romantic, right? Like it's not gonna happen. He's not gonna actually get the girl in the end. It's not that kind of story. That's not the story, right? The story is this relic, and how Sydney and Nigel work together to kind of figure out both the relic hunting stuff, but also the teaching stuff, right? Because there's a lot of moments where you'll walk in on, like the camera will pan in on Nigel and he's grading a shit ton of papers.
And what I liked about the show too is just the emphasis on teaching, right? So like every episode teaches you something about history, whether right or wrong,
Right.
culture, right or wrong,
or
but,
incomplete in some cases.
right.
Fairly wrong. It's just not completely there.
Yeah, like history revisionist, right? Like I think we got a lot of that in the 90s. But what I also liked was like, I think we talked about it earlier, was this emphasis on teaching. So like Sydney always prioritizing the love of learning. Like every time that she and Nigel go out, or every time we have a school scene or university scene, it's always, I don't know, I always feel like there's always like such a love for like teaching and learning and like history, right? So Sydney doing this kind of tribal dance in the pilot episode to excite students, right? Like what she tells Nigel is like, I really find it important to like really excite them at the beginning of the semester so that they feel like they're involved in history, that it's living, instead of otherwise they feel like it's just a book.
Yeah.
Right. And it's so apart from them.
Yeah, there's this really great scene, I think it's in the Nun episode, where they're kind of asking her like, why do you do this? Like, why are you so fascinated by history? And I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember the exact quotes, but she was saying something like, oh, like I moved around so much as a child because my dad was involved with, I don't know if it was military or something, but they moved around, or he was an architect. And she's like, we went all to all these countries and we were doing all these things, building all these things, but I never felt like I was living these cultures. And she's like, but then my like fourth grade history teacher or whoever it was, like had me fall in love with it, like because of the way she taught and the way she got me excited about learning about history. And then she's like, and that's why I became, Sydney Fox, the PhD relic hunter. And I remember thinking like, that is such a beautiful like story on like coming into like academia and education and just like falling in love with a subject in school and why we like what we like, and like influential teachers. I'm sure we've all had them in our own English backgrounds, and things like that, which I really enjoyed that moment.
Yeah, like how many of us were, we're all teachers
Mm.
and we all love learning. But how many of us were inspired by that one or two?
Yeah, I absolutely had teachers that I just loved, and they just really, I went to school wanting to learn from them. I loved being in their class. Yeah, absolutely.
Like, I think for all of us, like it's about paying, like, and for Sydney too, like it's about paying that moment of discovery and love forward. Right. And that's why we do the things that we do, why we're teachers, right? Because we're trying to pay that excitement forward as a way to thank the person that got us excited. Right.
Yeah. My second grade teacher, I remember at the end of the year, I cried because I didn't want to not have them as my teacher anymore. Like I really liked them. Like, and they were phenomenal. They still teach at my sister goes to the same school and she still teaches there. I mean, she shouldn't have her, but she teaches there still. So every so often when I'm picking my sister up or I'm going to the school play or whatever, I go and she's usually there and I go and say hi. But yeah, she totally remembers me. She's always so proud of me. But yeah, it's just really nice, like, because we all get those teachers, right?
Yeah, and I think that like having someone like of Asian descent in that role and is interesting because it reverses or upends that trope of the nerdy Asian, right? Like now you have a brawny, smart Asian, right? Who, like is all about the adventure versus like she doesn't sit still for very long. Yeah, she's very resourceful, she's very smart, but like she's definitely brawnier than Nigel, right? And so I think that's such an interesting choice and an important choice, right? Because now the trope is a stupid Asian.
It also counters the demure Asian, right? We talked about the women in Mulan, right? How she's not the typical like the feminine daughter, right? I think Sydney is totally feminine, right? And everything that she does, yet it's a different type of femininity, right? And it normalizes that. And I think that's definitely an important aspect of her character that I really enjoy seeing.
Yeah, like I think that's a good segue. Like how does Sydney add to this kind of definition or this conversation of womanhood and Asian womanhood? Like we focused a lot on women in our last couple of weeks, right? So how does she add to it? What does she say, right?
So I actually want to, I'm sorry, I'm referencing this episode a lot, but that's because there's a character in the Scotland episode that he's French and he refers to her, oh, you American women, right? And that line caught my attention, right? Because we talked a little bit about hyphenated Americans, right? So I think when we're talking about Asian women, we kind of just say all of Asian women. In this case, we definitely need to add that layer, right? The Asian American element. And I think she offers a new definition, or not necessarily a new, but a different definition of that femininity and that woman character, right? She can be feminine, but that femininity looks different for her than it would for somebody else, and that's okay, right? So that normalization, because you have Claudia, who's that very girly girl, right? She likes dresses and makeup and does all of like the really things that we ascribe to the girly girl aesthetic, I guess, right? And Sydney is a little bit different, right? She wears dresses, she wears skirts, she wears functional clothes too, though, right? But all of that is her. It's not like she'll wear a dress because she has to, right? She'll wear a dress because she wants to, and she'll look good in it, right? And so I think that the fact that we have this different picture just means, but we have these two very interesting women, because while Claudia is the secretary in a lot of episodes, she also does get a few episodes where she gets to kind of be the highlight, right? I'm thinking about the Cleopatra episode.
Great episode, by the way.
It is one of the stronger episodes, I think. But you see these two different definitions, and they're both totally okay. And then even with the female villains, a lot of them I have issues with, but you have them as examples too, right? Some of them are thieves, some of them are other professors, some of them are like these high-powered business women, which is fantastic to see. So I do think there's an attempt at diverse depictions of femininity, and in some cases it's done a little bit better than in other episodes.
Yeah, I'm holding on to that, conversation point of functional clothing. And I think that's something that ties like all our picks this month is just like functional clothing, like except for Mulan, right? Maybe because she's a Disney character in a cartoon, but
even Mulan, I would argue, actually, but go ahead.
Yeah, okay.
It does say today in casual clothing at the end, functional clothing at the end.
The way she flips it with that fan is pretty awesome. Probably not realistic. You're right, Jen. Sorry.
Well, like I know we talked a little bit about functional clothing in Jackie Chan, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like and how like all of it just seemed very functional. Like you can pick it up anywhere, Old Navy, Gap, Goodwill, whatever, right? And like definitely with Sydney, like there's points where like she does prioritize functional clothing over some things. There's some parts like in season 3 where she's like, is that really functional? Right? There's some calls to that, but yeah, I like that like Sydney's go-to is very like rustic, like very like boots on the ground. Like I love her boots, like her pants, right?
Indiana Jones version, right? Like
and like just like from Bend It Like Beckham, athletic clothes, right? Athletic leisure before it was athleisure, right? But I think I think that's such an interesting point to pick up on, because I think nowadays, and especially, and even then, like going back to that fetishization of Asian women characters, like you have that now with like K-pop stars and idols, right? Like, or like, I feel like there's a traditional way of like that Asian women should look, in a way of like very pin-up, very put together, right? Maybe like kind of very like sexy clothing, but like not functional clothing, but still like aesthetically pleasing, like aesthetics over functionality. That's where I'm headed, right? And I think that was the case back then too, where it's like very much aesthetics versus functionality. And so it's really interesting that we have these Asian women characters in these shows like actually prioritizing functional clothing, right? Because I think that is an attempt to kind of normalize, hey, like it's okay not to go for aesthetics, like that's maybe not realistic. We need to, you can be functional, still be confident, still be sexy, still be resourceful, still be kick-ass, right? So I think, I don't know where I'm headed with this, but like I like this idea of functional clothing as a tie between these women characters.
Well, I mean, and actually, because I keep bringing it up, tying it to Hercules and Xena, totally different, right? Sydney is practical. She's wearing pants because she's gonna be running, and she's wearing boots because she's gonna be running, and in the mud a lot, right? And I don't. That's not a dig at her. She's literally running through the jungle in a lot of these episodes, right? Or she's running up hills. So functional clothes, right? And then you got Xena. I love her. I do. I love my Xena. I love her to pieces. But Gabrielle's crop top and the really short skirt, in leather, that like when you're moving, it just seems like it'll be very constraining and difficult to move in that. But you have the difference, right? Where Sydney, you actually do have the function over form. Is that what it is?
Yeah, I think function over form. That's a good way to put it.
Okay. Well, and whereas with other shows like Xena, you prioritize the look that you're going for, right? And in doing so, what you end up giving up is part of the character, right? And with Sydney, you don't have that. The aesthetic very much matches the thing that she's doing, right? And I think that's one of the things that I really enjoy about this show. It makes sense in a lot of ways. Still has a lot of issues. We pointed a few of them out. But ultimately the story is centered on this strong woman who is very, like, her identity is very much her, right? From the way that she speaks, and by that I mean like the professor talk all the time, and then but then she's also able to like exist in different worlds, right? Like she'll go to the middle of nowhere in the world and still be able to observe and try to understand and mold herself to that culture, right? And not impose her own ideology on that culture to her clothes, right? And so all of that I think comes adds to the show, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I
Definitely.
think something that connects all of these titles together, besides, you know, the functionality of clothes, is the resourcefulness, right? Of each character. Like Jade is completely resourceful. Like she's gonna join Jackie on that adventure no matter what. And Sydney's, that's what something I really enjoyed about, you know, Sydney as a character in the show. Like she's very tactile. Like if she does not have the answer in front of her, like she doesn't have the piece of the map, or she doesn't have something to like figure out the puzzle, she'll try to figure it out based on the clues that she has in front of her. So like that means like she's touching everything, she's trying to figure out like how to get out of places. And you know, that small kind of action I feel like was very formative for me as a child, because I was like, okay, don't give up. Like you don't have something, it's not like you're completely dead or in the water, you can figure it out, right? I don't know how many students of mine, for whatever reason, like I tell them like, okay, like we're gonna do this on Google Drive, and then and I don't know why, but I get so many questions of like, how do you do the thing? And there is such a lack of, on some students' part, of just trying to investigate more, right? Like they just stop. Like if they can't figure it out, they'll stop and they'll ask me for the answer. And I'm like, there's YouTube videos, there's Google search, there are so many things you can do before you go to ask me first. And I don't know if that's going to hit wrong with some viewers or readers or hearers of this, but I just feel like there's, you know, that kind of action of just trying to figure it out on your own was something that I feel like I learned from all of these 90s shows, right? Like figure it out.
That's
Figure it out.
problem solving. You're right. I hadn't considered that. I think it goes back to Tori's point earlier about like the explicitness of these lessons, right? But that's something that these shows did a lot of, but also consistently, right? It wasn't just like, oh, in this episode we're going to show it throughout the episode, that problem solving skills, right? If one character doesn't have the answer, then another character will, or this character and this character will work together to kind of figure it out. And that's actually what the show becomes about, right? Not necessarily the relic itself, but how do we find the answers that we need to find the relic, right? And so that's actually something that I don't necessarily think shows emphasize anymore as much, right? Because even when we're talking about these serialized shows, right, it becomes more about like how it emotionally impacts each individual character, right? Which is fine. I mean, focus on emotions is important, but not necessarily the small steps that one takes to get to that answer. So the focus is different. I hadn't figured that out. You're right, Jen. It's a really astute.
Yeah, I totally see that. Like my sister doesn't know how to do anything ever without asking. And I'm like, think critically.
I need to rewatch every single 90s show and like, oh my goodness, what am I gonna do this summer? I need to go back and rewatch all of my 90s shows. And yeah, this is also really good.
But I think it's very unique to the 90s because my husband, who's not a 90s kid, I also feel like he thinks about things a lot and he thinks very deeply about things a lot, but I also feel like critical thinking isn't there a lot of the time either. It's like, oh, well, this thing won't work. I'm like, yeah, so figure it out. Like, but
Well, and you know, actually, I know this is actually going to go into a very academic field, but critical thinking and the way that it's defined in Emile, for example, right? It's an Enlightenment ideal, and it's something that hasn't actually changed in 400, 500 years, right? So the way that it's presented in our media, fuck, man, I'm sorry, this is mind blown. There's like so many ideas right now popping through my head. I can't even put my words
we
to it.
just found Brenda's PhD dissertation.
I just
No.
read minds.
No, so actually the class that I'm going to be teaching this summer is children's literature. And so part of it
You got a
is,
lit class?
I did get a lit
That's
class.
amazing. Congratulations.
I forgot. Okay, I haven't told everyone. Apparently, I'm sorry. I meant to. But part of it is how we're forming this idea of the child, but also how to teach children, right? So
Right.
I'm thinking about how one, because you can't teach critical thinking, right? You guide
Right.
people through critical thinking. And so that's one of the things that 90s shows did a lot. So I'm thinking about that right now. So it's all these conversations are happening in my head. I do apologize for that. So I didn't mean to.
The Gemini. Gemini.
Are you teaching children's lit at CC or university?
University.
Nice. Congratulations. That's a huge, for everybody who's not a teacher, that's a really, really big deal for an adjunct. Like, we're usually constricted to freshman composition, so the first English class you take when you enter the college. So it's a really, really, really big deal. So congratulations, Brenda.
I'm really excited and terrified. And please let the class take. Please don't. Please
Oh, I'm sending all the vibes. Like,
it'll take. But yeah, I think that there, going back to that conversation, I feel like going back to serialized shows, it's kind of going off the notion of edge of your seat. Right? So it's like it's feeding you clues, right? And it's leading you to that eventual like mystery solver, right? But it's feeding you clues versus teaching you to like figure it out, right? Like I still figured, I think that if people are into spoilers or really into TV, like that's a very engaging process of critical thinking, like serialized show, right? Because I know that I'm like always hypothesizing, oh, I think this is how it's going to end, right?
Yeah.
But I also think like for people, but I also grew up with like shows like, Relic Hunter and such, where like I was, I'm being taught, figure it out on your own before someone tells you, or you need to go to that authority figure, or, give up completely, try to figure it out on your own. And so I think that that's a very different kind of show that students or younger folks are kind of tuning into now, right? Where they're just being fed, they're being spoon fed and being taught to wait for the answer, right? And I think that's why you have a lot of reticent individuals where just like, I don't know the answer. You didn't give me the answer. I'm asking you right now, instead of the individual trying to figure it out for themselves, right? I don't know. It's a point of frustration for me as a teacher where like, I don't understand why they're not trying to figure it out by themselves. Like there are a bunch of resources out there, and there's a plethora of resources now, right? There's YouTube, there's just like the internet is just a site of just
WikiHow.
Access to information has never been easier, and yet the impulse to look for that information isn't always there. It is the frustrating topic of discussion among teachers, because we can say, well, you can Google it, but regardless of how many times you repeat that, sometimes it's not necessarily our students' first impulse, and that's mind-boggling sometimes, but it's also frustrating.
right.
But mind you, these are usually in situations where we're not actually talking about access, right? Because we're in a space where the computer is literally in front of them and they can look at it, right? And those are the kinds of spaces that we're talking about, right? Not
or spaces where like you've given all of the, like, so I get these questions a lot from students. We'll have an essay. I'm very detailed on what I want from you. how long it should be, if you're getting stuck, ways to get around it. I'm very, very detailed, and I'll get questions that aren't clarification questions, because clarification is completely different. Like, it's like, okay, am I understanding this correctly? Totally different. But I'll get things like for example, like we have a research paper in one of my classes, and the prompt is very specific on what I want you guys researching, the types of sources I want you to find, and things like that. And I do this whole thing on how to be a researcher. And like, they have to send me proposals, because I know people don't read the prompt, even though we read it together in class. Like, it's very confusing for me. In the world of COVID-19, I make a video on it that you can rewatch at your leisure that has everything in it. But I digress. But the amount, I'd say about 50%, 50% of the proposed topics were not even ballpark related to what my prompt was. And I was like, that following the prompt is part of what, like, you can write me a beautiful, beautiful A+ paper, but if it doesn't follow the prompt, it doesn't get a passing grade, because I'm not judging to see how beautifully you can write. I'm saying, can you follow instructions? But yeah.
Right, and so that's bringing it back to Relic Hunter, right? Oftentimes, one of the things that we see with Relic Hunter is the directions will be written on a manuscript or on a beautiful wall, right? They'll be etched in or they'll be drawn on. And so part of what the show follows is how Sydney translates. Sometimes she's familiar, she can read the language, sometimes she can't. Sometimes she has to rely on Nigel. And a lot of the times what ends up happening is they have to rely on some codex, right? Or a Rosetta Stone type of thing that actually gives them a way to translate, right? So they'll have the book and they're looking at the language and like going through it word by word. And so it's a tedious thing, right? So obviously it doesn't make for very exciting storytelling. So that's what ends up happening is while Nigel is translating, someone will be fighting with Sydney, right? And so,
Yeah.
but you actually see the scene simultaneously, and you do actually see the process of finding that answer on screen. And so a lot of the times, you kind of see that in some of our media today, but not as much as you did in the 90s. I feel like the 90s were just one of those times where we're like, you know what, we really need to, this is going to take some time, but we also need the action. So we need the best of both worlds, right? We need the problem solving element, but we also need the violence in here, right? And so you really did get a really interesting visual of what that looks like, while simultaneously showing viewers how to arrive at those answers that I think is the critical answers that everybody's looking for.
Right. And I think one of the things that the show highlights really well too is just mistakes, and that mistakes happen, right? And that there should be no fear in making those mistakes. And that's something that goes along with that problem solving, that critical thinking. Like, if you don't have something, you're going to try to figure it out on your own. You're going to make mistakes, obviously, but that's okay. Like, just keep going. That perseverance to keep going and to try to find the answer or arrive at an answer, I think was very critical to demonstrate to audiences, right? And I think that's something that's missing from serialized dramas nowadays, is that the priority, I think, is just emotional health, maybe, and even just like, stimulation in terms of like mental stimulation, like spoon feeding you the mystery, and then also like getting you to engage on a more like what are humans and how do we engage with humans, right? That fear, I don't think, and the fear of making mistakes is not highlighted, right? Or it's kind of said like I feel like there's almost like you shouldn't make mistakes now, right? Like you should get to the answers pretty quickly.
I think about like the Flash, right? With a lot of the Flash storylines, it's him feeling bad about something he fucked up, right? And you should feel bad, absolutely. You
Right.
Flashpoint,
You have so many timelines,
right? And so the entire show becomes about fixing the mistake, right? And him learning, which is a great thing to do. But like, did you really need to spend an entire season of, I'm sorry, okay, so that's a side thing. But I agree with you, Jen. I think there's not enough emphasis on, you know what, mistakes are okay and they're going to happen, right? And yeah, you're going to feel bad about them, but it's not like the measure of your character is not going to be you feeling bad about that mistake. Lord knows I've wasted a lot of my life feeling bad about mistakes I've made. Things I should not have done. But the measure of one's character, not just myself, but others, is how well you learn from that mistake and then how you move forward, right? Not just fixing the mistake in the moment, but then what steps to take beyond that to make sure that that mistake isn't repeated, right? So that it doesn't become a character flaw at some point, right? And I think one of the things that 90s shows tried to do is emphasize that. But beyond that, I think one of the things that this show does really well is highlighting those that impulse to try to be better, right? And to try to not necessarily just fix the past, because that's not a thing. We can't go back and fix the past, right? But to move forward, right? And to take those small steps necessary right now so that they make an impact later, whether that be making sure that the artifact gets to the right place, right? In some cases it's a museum, in some cases it's actually the people that it belongs to, which I really like, because it's something that it's a conversation that happens in academic circles. Should relics be in museums, when it's actually an issue of access, right? And a lot of it's not necessarily democratizing art in the way that art should be democratized, right? So I think that, and a lot of the episodes for Relic Hunter, the artifacts ended up with the people that they belong to. And I think that a comment like that in the 90s was progressive, right? Because it definitely wasn't something that you see with Indiana Jones. A lot of it's like, oh no, this should be in a museum, this should be in a museum. And that's a default answer, right? And the answer for that is often a lot more nuanced, right? Because in a lot of times the artifacts that ended up in museums were stolen artifacts, and they really belong with the people who created them. So I do like that there's actually a lot of, oh, this should end up in the museum in Relic Hunter, but at least it tries to balance it in a way that I think shows in the 90s sometimes just failed to. So I do think that that's great. And in the context of our Asian Pacific Islander month, I think Sydney Fox is definitely one of our top heroines. She's just awesome, kick-ass, smart, and just really fun to watch. Whether you're frustrated half the time like I am, because believe me, even when I'm frustrated, I'm really enjoying the series, and usually it's the series that frustrate me that make me love it more. Or you're just casually watching while playing Animal Crossing, which I am guilty of doing as well. I think it's an excellent show and definitely worth a watch. Okay. So for next week, we will be continuing and transitioning into Pride Month. June is one of my favorite months of the whole year for multiple reasons, one of them being that it is Pride Month. We are going to actually read Fence. It is a Boom comic that I don't actually know. Was it Tori or Jen who started reading it? Because they were both just talking about it so much.
I think I started and I was like, Jen, you have to read this. It's so hot. I mean, good. And then she was like, sure, why not? Because it was on sale. And I think
Jen had it in her. Yeah, Jen already had it in her library. She's just like, oh yeah, it's in my reading stack. I'll get to it sometime. Yeah. And then she got to it, and then they have not stopped talking about it.
I think I read the entire thing in one sit down because I could not physically put the book down, and I immediately pre-ordered the second one. I was like, I need this now. I think the third one just came out or is about to come out real soon.
It came out. Yeah.
Today I actually put overtone in my hair. It's supposed to look pink. I don't think you can see it. But as I was waiting for the color to go in, I actually started reading Fence. And as soon as we wrap up this call, I'm going to go finish it because you're not wrong.
It's so good.
It's really good.
Oh, it's so hot.
It's really, I think it falls in line with what Boom is doing as a company, right? Yeah. It's a cute read. It's a very light read, and it's, definitely adding to the sports conversation and how sports are viewed. But it's also adding to like that queer conversation.
There's so many layers about being queer and an athlete, being queer and a minority, being queer, a minority and an athlete. Like there's just so many like layers that it's phenomenal.
So we're excited to talk about it next week, if you can't tell.
Yay. So if you're excited like we are, please join us in reading ahead, and then you'll hear us talk about it next week.
All right. Well, Have a wonderful quarantine week, everyone. Thank you for
Yeah,
joining
stay
us.
safe, stay healthy. Bye.